Between 1792 and 1800, over 400 enslaved men, women, and children built what would become the most recognizable building in America. Their names were deliberately erased from official records. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves across the District of Columbia. For 2 centuries, the government maintained these omissions weren't accidental, they were policy. In 1901, a restoration crew discovered something beneath the East Wing's foundation that made the superintendent order an immediate halt to all excavation. The workers were sworn to silence. The discovery was reburied within hours. What they found suggested the original construction involved far more than simple labor exploitation. It pointed to systematic concealment of deaths that occurred under circumstances the young republic could never afford to acknowledge. Tonight, you'll hear what those records actually contained. Before we continue with the story of how America's greatest symbol was built on suffering deliberately hidden from history, I want to ask you something. If you're listening from Washington, D.C., Virginia, Maryland, or anywhere in the United States, leave a comment telling us where you're from. These stories belong to all of us, and knowing where our listeners are connecting from makes this community even stronger. Now, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear so you never miss the dark chapters of American history they tried to bury. Let's uncover the truth together. The discovery in 1901 wouldn't be the last time someone stumbled onto evidence of what really happened during those 8 years of construction. But to understand why those findings were so dangerous, you need to know how the project began and who was really forced to build it. Philadelphia served as the nation's capital in 1790, but the Residence Act passed that July mandated a new federal district along the Potomac River. President Washington himself selected the precise location in January 1791, 10 square miles carved from land ceded by Maryland and Virginia. The site was hardly the grand landscape depicted in later paintings. It was malarial swampland, dense with mosquitoes, unbearably humid in summer, and populated by scattered tobacco plantations worked by enslaved people who'd been farming that soil for generations. The commissioners appointed to oversee construction faced an immediate problem. The federal government had no money. The entire project, President's House, Capitol, Department buildings, roads, would cost an estimated $400,000, an astronomical sum for a nation still drowning in Revolutionary War debt. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson proposed a solution that seemed elegant in its simplicity: hire enslaved workers. Their masters would be paid a rental fee, typically $5 per month per enslaved person, while the workers themselves would receive nothing beyond basic food and shelter. This arrangement, Jefferson argued in a letter dated March 1792, would keep costs manageable while ensuring the work proceeds without delay or complaint. The chief architect, James Hoban, an Irish immigrant who designed several prominent buildings in Charleston, submitted plans for the President's House in July 1792. His design drew heavily from Leinster House in Dublin, featuring Georgian symmetry and ambitious scale. When Washington reviewed the plans, he insisted on making the building even larger, 1/5 bigger than Hoban's original proposal. This expansion would require substantially more labor, more materials, and more time. The commissioners sent notices throughout Maryland and Virginia. Masters could hire out their enslaved workers to the federal construction project. The compensation was reliable, and the government promised to return the workers unharmed. That promise would prove worthless. By November 1792, approximately 150 enslaved workers had been assembled at the construction site. They came from plantations throughout the region, from Loudoun County, Charles County, Montgomery County, Prince George's County. Their masters' names appear in the commissioners' payment ledgers: Daniel Carroll, Notley Young, Samuel Davidson, William Brent. But the workers themselves were listed differently. The ledgers show only first names, sometimes not even that, just Negro Man, or Negro Boy, followed by an age estimate. Tom, age 23. Peter, age 19. A boy called Harry, perhaps 14. A man named Len, who the records suggest was over 50, too old for such brutal work, but hired out anyway because his master needed the monthly payment. The work began immediately, though winter was approaching. The first task involved clearing the site, removing trees, draining swampland, excavating the foundation. This meant working waist-deep in freezing mud, using nothing but shovels, pickaxes, and raw strength. The commissioner's letters from that first winter make brief mention of difficulties with the Negro labor due to weather, but provide no details about what those difficulties entailed. A note dated December 14, 1792 refers to the replacement of 3 workers who could not continue without explaining why they couldn't continue or what happened to them. One worker who did leave a trace in the records was a man named Isaac, hired from a plantation owner named Samuel Hanson. Isaac was a skilled carpenter, one of several enslaved craftsmen brought to the project because their expertise was essential. The commissioner's correspondence shows Isaac worked on the interior carpentry throughout 1793 and 1794 and that Hanson received payment for Isaac's labor through November 1794. Then Isaac's name disappears from the ledgers. No note of his return to Hanson's plantation. No record of sale or transfer. Simply absent from the documents as though he'd never existed. Another name that appears frequently in early records is Peter Lennox, a quarryman enslaved by Martha Custis Peter, step-granddaughter of George Washington. Lennox was tasked with supervising stone cutting at the government quarry in Aquia, Virginia, where the cream-colored sandstone for the president's house was extracted. The quarry work was among the most dangerous. Massive blocks of stone had to be cut, lifted, and transported without modern equipment. A single mistake could crush a man instantly. Lennox's name appears in payment records through 1796, noted as reliable and skilled. After 1796, he too vanishes from documentation. The commissioners, Thomas Johnson, Daniel Carroll, and David Stewart, rotated through various appointments, but their correspondence reveals a consistent anxiety about the project timeline. President Washington wanted the house completed before his term ended in 1797. This pressure translated into grueling work schedules for the enslaved laborers. Letters between the commissioners and Hoban reference working from dawn until dark when weather permits and double crews on foundation work to meet deadlines. These brief mentions hint at the reality: 16-hour days, 7 days a week during good weather, with no compensation beyond minimal food. The living conditions were equally harsh. The enslaved workers were housed in temporary wooden structures near the construction site, crude barracks that offered little protection from the elements. An expense record from March 1793 notes the purchase of straw for Negro quarters, suggesting they slept on the ground with only straw for bedding. Another entry from August 1793 authorizes the purchase of salt fish and cornmeal for feeding Negro workers, the cheapest possible provisions. No meat, no vegetables, just enough to keep them working. Disease was inevitable. The swampland bred malaria, typhoid, dysentery. The commissioner's letters occasionally mentioned sickness among the workforce, always framed as an inconvenience to the construction schedule. A note from June 1793 complains that the flux has taken hold among the Negro laborers, reducing our available workforce by nearly a third. The flux, dysentery, could kill within days if severe. The letter says nothing about treatment or recovery, only about the delay it caused. Medical care for enslaved workers was minimal at best. The commissioners hired a physician named William Thornton to attend to workers, but his compensation records show he was paid far less for treating enslaved workers than for treating free white laborers. More tellingly, Thornton's bills show dramatically fewer visits to enslaved workers, despite their larger numbers. When an enslaved person fell too ill to work, the most common solution was to send them back to their master and hire a replacement. This practice left no paper trail of what happened to those who were returned, whether they recovered, whether they died, whether they were sold off to recoup the lost rental income. The Scottish stonemason Colin Williamson kept a more detailed record than most. Williamson supervised much of the stonework and maintained a diary that survived in his family's papers until donated to the Library of Congress in 1968. His entries from 1794 and 1795 provide rare glimpses into the daily reality. The Negro men worked the stone despite bleeding hands, he wrote in April 1794. They are given no gloves, no proper tools for their hands, yet are expected to produce the same quality as trained masons. Several have infections that should be tended. I mentioned this to the commissioner's representative who said treatment would be provided when time allowed. Time, it seems, never allows. Williamson's diary also records an incident from July 1794 that doesn't appear in any official documentation. Today, a scaffold collapsed on the south wall. 3 men fell, 2 of them Negroes. The white man was carried to the physician immediately. The two Negroes were left where they fell for nearly an hour before anyone attended them. One appears to have a broken back. I suspect he will not survive, and if he does, he will never walk again. This troubles me greatly, but I am told this is not my concern. The man with the suspected broken back was likely a worker named Ben, enslaved by William Brent. Ben's name appears in payment ledgers through June 1794, then stops. Brent continued to receive payment for Negro labor in July and August 1794, but the name changes to Negro Man Jim. This pattern, sudden name substitutions in the payment records without explanation, occurs repeatedly throughout the construction period, suggesting workers were being replaced, but the circumstances of their departure were deliberately left unrecorded. By 1795, the structure's shell was largely complete, but interior work would take several more years. The project expanded to include not just the president's house, but also the surrounding landscape, roads, and ancillary buildings. This expansion meant the workforce actually grew during the latter half of the decade. At its peak in 1798, somewhere between 400 and 500 workers labored on the site and in related operations like the quarries, brick kilns, and lumber mills. The majority were enslaved. The commissioner's papers from this period grow increasingly terse about the enslaved workforce. Earlier letters at least mentioned them by category: Negro carpenters, Negro laborers, Negro quarrymen. After 1795, the references become vaguer. Workers hired from area plantations, contracted labor, servants. This linguistic shift wasn't accidental. As the project gained prominence and public attention, the commissioners became more careful about how they documented the workforce composition. They understood even then that the optics were problematic. Here was the house of the president, the symbol of the new republic, being built by people who had no freedom in that republic. George Washington himself visited the construction site multiple times throughout the 1790s. His diary entries about these visits focus on architectural progress and timeline concerns. He never once mentions the enslaved workers in these entries, despite the fact that they made up at least 70% of the workforce. This omission speaks volumes about how the founders chose to see, or not see, the labor that built their institutions. The white laborers on site, immigrants mostly from Ireland and Scotland, were paid actual wages, typically $1 per day for skilled craftsmen, 50 cents for ordinary laborers. They could leave if they chose. They could complain about conditions. They had names in the records that included surnames, places of origin, next of kin. When they were injured, they received medical care and compensation. When they died, they were buried in marked graves and their families notified. None of this applied to the enslaved workers. They had no choice, no voice, no recourse. They built the house stone by stone, brick by brick, knowing they would never walk through its doors as anything but servants. Knowing their children would inherit their chains, knowing their names would be forgotten, while the names of the architects, commissioners, and presidents would be etched into history books. But some of them left marks anyway. Small, deliberate acts of presence that would only be discovered centuries later. In the spring of 1796, James Hoban reported a problem to the commissioners. Several stone blocks being set into the north wall bore strange markings. Shallow scratches that appeared deliberate rather than accidental damage from quarrying or transport. Hoban's letter dated April 3, 1796, describes them as crude symbols or letters, purpose unknown. He asked whether the blocks should be replaced or simply turned inward so the markings wouldn't be visible. The commissioner's reply, dated April 10, instructs Hoban to turn the stones inward and continue construction. The markings are likely meaningless scratches from handling, the letter states. There is no need to delay work for such trivialities. The incident was considered closed, but the markings weren't meaningless. They were names. Enslaved workers with stone-cutting skills had carved their names, or sometimes just initials, into blocks they'd shaped. The carvings were subtle, easily dismissed as accidental marks unless you knew what to look for. They were acts of extraordinary courage, because if discovered during the carving, the punishment would have been severe. But they did it anyway. These men whose names appeared in ledgers only as Tom or Peter or Negro Man. They carved Th. and place, and sometimes full names like Isaac, into stone, then sent those stones to become permanent parts of the president's house. It was their way of saying, we were here. We built this. Remember us. Hoban never reported finding additional marked stones, which suggests either he stopped noticing or stopped reporting. Given the commissioner's dismissive response, the latter seems more likely. Why bother the commissioners with something they'd already deemed irrelevant? The marked stones weren't discovered again until 1902 during Theodore Roosevelt's renovation of the building. Workers removing plaster from interior walls found the stones with their carvings turned inward, exactly as Hoban had been instructed to place them. The renovation supervisor, a man named Charles McKim, made a note of the discovery in his private records, found various stones with crude markings on interior faces. Some appear to be initials or names. Origin uncertain, likely made by workers. No further investigation was ordered. The stones were replastered over, and the truth was buried once more.